Chapter 17. Yard. With Dave locked in the hole, James felt vulnerable. His need for sleep finally overcame his fear at around 4 a.m, an hour after Stanley Duff had been stretchered off to the prison hospital. The cell door and the gates onto the exercise yard opened at 9, but most kids were still asleep as James limped towards the bathroom with his bar of soap and toilet roll. He had the sharpened toothbrush handle tucked into his waistband, just in case. Bam hovered with his mop while James took a dump. The steel bowls were mounted on the wall, without doors or partitions, so you got zero privacy. The shower was even worse. The water only ran while you held the button down, and the lukewarm dribble meant you couldn't get soap out of your hair. James dried off quickly, desperate to get out of the rank cell and breathe fresh air. A corridor led past 3 other cells and up a short ramp. To get to the exercise yard, you stood in line to get patted down by a hack before passing through a metal detector. As James's canvas slipper took its first step into the sand, another inmate passed him a white paper bag containing his breakfast. James got called back before he had a chance to see what he'd got. Rose? Superintendent Bob Frey was the pot-bellied, yellow-toothed man who'd crushed James's foot in the reception room the previous afternoon. Frey took James under a veranda and made him stand with his back pinned to the cell block wall. Been in my cell block less than 15 hours, haven't you? About that, sir. I got 2 brothers in the hospital. One of 'em's just a busted nose and concussion, but the other fella's got neck damage that's going to cost this prison tens of thousands in medical bills. James shifted awkwardly, not knowing how to answer. Then I got your brother in the hole. Frey grinned. You ever been in the hole, boy? No, sir. You got no light, no ventilation, no strip of clothes, and no toilet. We hose it out once a day, like an animal cage. Any more trouble and that's where I'll have you. Understood? Yes, sir, James nodded. How long's Dave in there for? Long enough, Frey grinned. Now get out of my sight. James opened up his breakfast bag as he walked onto the sun-bleached yard. The milk was warm, the 3 pieces of fruit were past their best, and the muffin was on the dry side, but it was edible, and James was starving. His last decent meal had been the fried chicken 2 nights earlier. The yard was oval-shaped and the size of 3 football pitches. It was scooped out of the desert basin around the back half of the cell block. The facilities were basic: shelters to keep off the sun, a few basketball hoops and chin-up bars, and the small prefabricated building where lunches were served. Beside the perimeter fence was a 5-metre stretch of concrete behind a red line, which was known as the shooting gallery. No inmate was allowed on the shooting gallery, and to make it clear, the notices dotted along the fence had a little stick man standing inside a gun sight with lethal force authorised written beneath him. Hey, Abe said, jogging up behind James with a banana in his hand. James smiled. You did me a big favour last night. Dave was supposed to be watching my back. I just gotta hope Stanley doesn't have any pals popping out of the woodwork. The 2 big white guys were in the shower when I went for a piss. They asked if I'd seen you. Which guys? James asked anxiously. Elwood and the one with the German name. Kirch. What did they want? They just asked where you were. Did they sound angry? Abe shrugged. All they said was one sentence. Have you seen the little psychopath? I told them I thought you were already out on the yard. They called me a psychopath? James said, unsure if this was a bad sign or a mark of respect. I think you broke that guy's neck. It was me or him. He was about to slit my throat. James threw away the core of his apple and took a slug from his bottle of milk. He was frightened. If Dave had been around, Elwood and Kirch would have been manageable. But with Dave in the hole, he'd be outgunned if things turned heavy. I'll wait for them to come to the yard, James said. At least there's space to run away out here. James and Abe found a spot under a shelter with a view over the whole yard and sat together in the dirt. Kirch came through the metal detector first. He was a 17-year-old skinhead, 2 meters tall, with massive pectoral muscles inside a sweat-stained vest. Elwood was taller and thinner, shaved bald. A swastika with mum written underneath it was tattooed on his neck. Curtis came next. He was an average build and the same height as James, but he looked undernourished, standing between his massive bodyguards. The three boys joined up with a bunch of similarly fierce-looking skinheads from another cell, who were standing around a set of chin-up bars taking it in turns to do sets. The gang was bigger and meaner than James had expected. He realised they were going to have no problem hurting him if they wanted to. A couple of minutes later, while Kirch was on the chin-up bar, Elwood spotted a little guy passing by. He tucked the kid's head under his arm and squeezed until it turned red. After a while, he let go and knocked him down with a savage right hook. The kid was fighting tears and holding onto his face as he walked off. "I got a split," Abe said, shocked by what he'd just witnessed. James knew Abe wasn't going to be any help in a fight against the Elwoods and Kirches of the world, but he appreciated having a friendly face to talk to. "What's your problem?" James asked. "They already asked me where you are. If they find me with you, they're not going to like it." "I guess I'll have to face them sometime today," James said pensively. "So go and earn yourself some merit points by telling them I'm right here." After what had happened to the last passerby, Abe didn't sound keen. "Why don't you go over to them?" James pointed a finger at the armed hack standing on the roof of the cell block less than 10 meters away. "I feel safer here." Abe reluctantly set off across the dirt towards Elwood and the others. His steps seemed to slow down as he got closer. At one point, Abe changed direction so much, James thought he was going to chicken out and walk straight by. Abe got off with a nod of thanks for his trouble. Elwood immediately set off towards James, backed up by an entourage that included Kirch and 3 younger skinheads, with Curtis dragging up the rear. James looked up for comfort, only to discover that the hack on the roof had disappeared. "You look pale, Rose," Elwood said when he got up close. "I figure 6 against 1 is never good," James said, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "True," Elwood grinned, looking back at his crew. "What is it you want?" "I like the way you dealt with Stanley Duff." "Those two started it," James said. "I didn't go looking for trouble." "I've got no beef over that pair of walnut brains," Elwood said. "But you gotta understand my concern when guys like you and your brother arrive in my cell and start turning people over." James nodded. "I've either got to cut you to pieces or cut you a deal. Unless you've already got one with the Latinos." "My brother said Caesar was trying to stir up trouble between us," James said, feeling a glimmer of confidence, as he sensed that he might get through the meeting unscathed. "But Caesar only cares about the other Latinos." Elwood nodded. "Your bro sounds smart." "When he stays awake," James said bitterly. "So why'd you accept gifts from Caesar?" "Because I was hungry." Elwood roared out with a false laugh, which set off all his cronies. "I guess free food is free food, wherever it comes from. So what about your bro? You got word?" James shook his head. "That hack, Frey, pulled me over. He wouldn't tell me when they're letting him out of the hole." Elwood laughed again. "I've been in that hole enough times, but the max is 48 hours if you're under 18. After that, they either put you in a single cell or back in the dorm." "Right," James said, relieved that Dave would probably be back soon. "So, to business," Elwood said. "Me and Kirch run our cell. That means everyone kicks up to us, including you." James nodded. Not that he was in any position to negotiate. "I want you and your brother to give me $10 of commissary each, every week. In return, I'll give you Abe." "Abe?" James said, confused. "Abe's your personal property. Rip off his commissary, beat his brains in, do what you like. I don't want you touching any of the others. They belong to Kirch and me. I'll also set you up with decent prison-issue clothes and blankets, and I'll make it known that I'm on your side when the Duff brothers come back." "Sounds fair," James nodded as they shook on the deal. "Did you lose anything good when you came in through reception?" Elwood asked. "Only my trainers." "For $10 of commissary, I can get them back if you want them." "Course," James said, looking at his canvas slip-ons. "These things are rubbish." "You better stick with us until your brother comes back," Elwood said, scratching at the swastika on his neck. "Not everyone around here is a sweetie pie like me." Chapter 18. Beasts. James loved animals when he was tiny. The furry toys on his bed, the singing characters in animated movies, and the overweight cat that wandered into his nan's garden, knowing it would get a saucer of milk just for bothering to turn up. Aged 7, James did his first school project on lions. His mum taped a show off the Discovery Channel that was on after bedtime. He watched the female lions licking their cubs and lazing under a tree in the sun. Then the animals went hunting. The lionesses chased into a herd of antelope. They dragged down a straggler and began tearing it apart, ripping off its legs, clawing open the stomach, and then dipping their snouts inside the twitching carcass, tearing out hunks of flesh and running their long tongues through the blood on their faces. Until that moment, James had no idea nature could be so brutal. He got as far as the living room door, intending to find his mum and start bawling, but something changed his mind. He went back to the couch, tentatively rewound the video, and watched it again. He watched it over and over, appalled but utterly fascinated by what the lions were doing. The in-your-face nastiness of the young skinheads in the Arizona Max exercise yard reminded James of the video for the first time in years. They brought out the same mixture of feelings, power and viciousness, combining into a perverse kind of glamour. James showed off, working up a sweat on the chin-up bar before lying back in the dirt next to Elwood and listening to him talk about things the gang of skinheads had done. Elwood pointed out scared kids who handed their commissary form to him each week in return for not getting beaten up too badly. He revelled in stories about people he'd tortured, stabbed, poured boiling water over, and bullied to the point where they'd try to kill themselves. The history of violence wasn't all one way. Elwood proudly showed off scars on his leg, chest, and back from 3 different knife attacks. He said you could never judge who would snap and come at you with a knife. It was as likely to be the puny little bookworm as the brooding psychopath with arms like joists. James was appalled, but he listened intently and laughed when he was expected to. It was mostly out of relief. The last 48 hours had been amongst the most traumatic of his life, but with the skinheads offering some protection, the tight ball in his stomach had eased off. He finally felt he was getting to grips with the mission. The next step was to chum up with Curtis. Lauren didn't have much to do back at the house. Her part of the mission would only begin once James and Dave escaped. She welcomed the chance to catch up on sleep and relax after basic training, though it would have been more fun if there'd been someone like Bethany to hang out with. John took her to a shopping mall and even let her drive part of the way, so she could get used to handling the car in traffic. Unfortunately, the pair had radically different ideas on shopping. Lauren would have happily cruised the mall all day, nosing around, maybe buying clothes and some things for her new room on campus, before stopping off at the food court for lunch. John's idea of shopping was to write a list and take the place by storm, finding the quickest route between shops you had to visit on the map by the entrance and then charging from one to the next. When Lauren suggested that they have a look around before leaving, John scowled at her like she was a 3-headed alien and steamed towards the car park. The latex swimming sock was the one good thing to come out of the trip. Lauren could pull it over the small dressing on her foot and it would keep dry while she was in the pool. It was the hottest part of the day when they got back to the house, and she put it to immediate use. She swam a few gentle lengths, but mostly just floated on a blow-up lounger and laughed at the rude bits in a teen magazine she'd got at the mall. John had threatened lunch, but after an hour, Lauren dripped into the kitchen, only to find him yelling at a telephone. As far as I'm concerned, well, I don't know if he can do it. Sure, James has his head screwed on, but we are talking about a 13-year-old boy. So what does Scott Warren say? Okay. If he can get me in, I'll drive up there straight away. Was that Marvin? Lauren asked. Are the boys okay? John had been so involved in the call he hadn't noticed Lauren standing behind him. James is fine, John said, but there was a fight and Dave ended up in the hole. He's had a bad night in there and... Listen, everything's up in the air and I don't know all the details myself. Can I leave you here on your own for a couple of hours? Don't spend any more time in the pool. You've got fair skin and it's not used to that kind of sun. What if anyone calls? I'm on my mobile, John said, snatching his keys and a false FBI badge off the kitchen cabinet. Don't wander off from the house. I'll pick up something for dinner on the way back. James's hot lunch was watery mash, peas, and a rectangular slab of mincemeat that everyone, including the servers, referred to as baked turd. Dessert was a comparatively edible fruit sponge washed down with the inevitable government surplus milk. Not bad, compared to the filth you get in Omaha, James said. Practically gourmet. You want another dessert? Kirch asked. Sure, James said. Can I go up to the counter and get one? The 5 skinheads around the table laughed. Just tax one, Curtis said. James looked over his shoulder at the table behind him. He realised he'd look weak in front of his new friends if he didn't rip off someone's pudding, but fate had twisted the knife. Out of the 4 kids at the next table, Abe was the only one who hadn't started eating his sponge. James stood up. Abe, man, he said awkwardly. You eating that pudding? I'm eating it, Abe said guardedly. The skinheads roared with outrage. You cannot say that, man, Elwood gasped, shaking his head and pounding on the table. Serious disrespect. Abe realised the error of his ways and pushed the plastic bowl towards James. But it wasn't fast enough for Kirch, who reached over and dragged Abe off his chair by the scruff of his shirt. You got no manners, boy, Kirch shouted. He banged his fist against Abe's mouth, then dropped him to the floor before spitting a mouthful of milk and chewed up food in his hair. James looked anxiously at the hack standing behind the serving counter, but it was exactly like Scott Warren said. Hacks didn't interfere as long as nobody was getting killed. You'd better start learning, Kirch growled. Elwood and the others were laughing as Abe crawled back to his seat with milk streaking down his face. James joined the laughter as he took Abe's pudding and sat back down, but he really felt terrible. Abe had saved his life by waking Dave up a few hours earlier. Now he had to sacrifice their friendship for the good of the mission. It was the middle of the day when they trawled back out onto the exercise yard. With the temperature touching the 40s, Kirch led the gang to the cell. With no air conditioning, it was no cooler indoors than out, but at least you were shielded from the blinding sunlight. James's status as an associate of Elwood and Kirch meant a bed nearer the door. Kirch took 5 seconds to bust open the combination lock on the bed opposite his own. He threw out Stanley Duff's belongings while James collected his things from his old bed in the middle. Stanley had some decent stuff. James grabbed his deodorant and shampoo, as well as a bunch of snack foods and a radio. What James didn't want got thrown out for the weaker guys to fight over. Abe grudgingly accepted first pick of an electric razor, some rice crackers, and a half-used toilet roll. That was messed up in the canteen, James whispered guiltily. Abe had a fat lip from the punch. A guy like you and a guy like me were never going to move the same crew for long, he said casually. James found Abe's acceptance of his low status depressing. Abe was doing 20 years, and looked like spending most of it getting slapped around and bullied. James wanted to think up some desperately clever scheme that would make everything fair, but he knew the world didn't work that way, least of all inside a place like Arizona Max. James's new bunk was comfortable. The bed had 3 thin mattresses laid on top of one another. Extras were only supposed to be issued to inmates with bad backs, but inevitably it was the bullies who gained the extra comfort. Elwood's connection in the prison laundry had already delivered James a spare set of sheets and an extra pillow, plus a towel and some underwear. It looked years newer than the rags he'd received in reception, and his black Nikes were supposed to be on their way. James laid back in his bed reading a book about the mafia that had belonged to Raymond Duff. It wasn't as exciting as the cover suggested, but it was all James had to take his mind off the heat, until a hack leaned over the gantry above his head and shouted his name. Rose, you got an EA. A what? Educational assessment, Curtis explained, shouting over the bed between them. They must have sharpened their act up. Usually takes weeks to sort out the new inmates. I'll show you the way if you like. I can ask if my books have arrived. Chapter 19. Curtis. The education area was built above the cells, but to get there, you had to go outside onto the yard and walk around the edge of the building, along a path enclosed in a wire cage. It was James's first chance to get to know Curtis, who kept to himself in the presence of the more powerful skinheads. What courses do you do? James asked, as they walked side by side. Everyone's supposed to get 3 hours education a day, Curtis explained. But there is not enough teachers for normal classes, so they just give you textbooks to read. I only go because you're allowed to buy extra books. It's supposed to be related to what you're learning, but the censor only stops a book if it tells you how to make explosives, or if it's a porno or something. Do they force us to go to class? Curtis laughed. It's compulsory, but imagine you're a teacher and you've got 20 guys like Elwood in your class. How hard would you try to make them turn up? See your point? James grinned. I'd like to do an art course, Curtis said. All I ever did when I was a kid was paint or draw. But all they'll let you have here are the stubby pencils like you get with your commissary forms. I did get a box of colouring pencils smuggled in, but the hacks wouldn't stand for any big stuff. James tried to gently move the conversation towards the idea of escaping as they rounded a corner. So, you ever getting out? James asked. Doesn't look like it, Curtis said. You? 18 years, James said. Not bad, Curtis said. You'll be in your 30s. You've got a shot at living some kind of life. I'm getting out way before 18 years, James grinned. Nobody escapes from here, James. This place is newly built, state of the art. Me and Dave worked out a plan when we were in Nebraska. If they'd ever let us out of solitary, we'd have pulled it too. But here's the weirdest coincidence. Omaha State and this joint are exactly alike. They must have been built by the same people. James knew that Omaha State and Arizona Max were twins, designed by the same architect, built by the same construction company, and opened within 6 months of each other. It was an essential detail in the background story that explained how James and Dave could know how to escape from Arizona Max within days of arriving. The exact same? Curtis said. More or less. Same security systems, same kind of cell blocks, even the same fixtures and fittings. When me and Dave were in solitary, we had this hack on our landing who used to talk to us all the time. He'd come over to my cell door for a chat. I think he felt sorry for me because I was young, but he was one of those guys who loved his own voice. He moaned non-stop. I mean, I'm the one locked in solitary 24 hours a day, but he'd be whinging about his life. His wife, his kids, his house, and about the superintendent busting his balls and keeping him on night shift. Whenever he moaned about work, I started asking subtle questions, like how many staff there were on duty at night and what kind of security passes they used. Dave's cell wasn't far away, and he started doing the same. By the time we'd been in solitary for a few weeks, this big mouth had told us way more than he should have. You really believe you could escape? I reckon I'd make it out the gate. The tricky part is what to do after that. You need money and connections to pay for a false identity and set up a new life. There's no point going on the run for a few weeks, getting caught, and ending up buried in solitary with 10 years added to your sentence. You've got to find a way of avoiding the cops for the whole rest of your life. How would you break out? Curtis asked. You've got to get out of a locked cell for starters. No offense, James said, but the only people who will ever know that are the ones going out with me. Curtis seemed to understand the need for secrecy, and they were nearly at the metal door of the education unit anyway. A hack patted the boys down before they passed through another metal detector. It was 2 flights of stairs up, then past 3 small classrooms to a door with Education Officer written on it. You mind if I go in quickly first? Curtis asked. I want to ask Mr. Haynes if my books have arrived. Curtis knocked on the door and got hailed in by a voice James recognised as Scott Warren. Isn't Haynes here? Curtis asked, looking surprised as he pushed the door open. Scott, who was sitting at a desk, shook his head. I'm covering for him today. James spotted John Jones standing behind the desk. Curtis pointed at James. I came to show him the way and see if my books were in. Yeah, sorry, Scott stuttered. What's your name, son? Curtis Oxford. Curtis, it's probably best if you wait until the education officer is back. Tomorrow. I'm not familiar with the procedure for handing out books. Curtis backed out of the office, looking at James. Do you know the way back on your own? James nodded. I'll see you out there. He stepped into the office and shut the door behind Curtis. John and Scott were both in a state of shock. They stared at a black and white CCTV monitor until it showed Curtis reaching the end of the corridor and starting down the stairs. "Sheesh," Scott said, putting both hands over his heart. "That gave me a fright. I never expected our target to come wandering into the room with you." "You might have guessed what was going on," John said tersely. "You only said we might have to meet in the visitor's room," James snapped back. "Well, whatever," John huffed. James felt his temper rise up as he ran his hand through his sweaty hair. "You know what?" he said angrily. "I'm boiling hot. I've not slept or had a decent shower. I've eaten nothing but crap food. I've seen people get beaten up, pepper sprayed, and have their skin burned off. I've even had some psycho come at me with a knife and try to kill me. If you don't like the job I'm doing here, you can take this mission and shove it right up your ass." John looked startled by the outburst. "We appreciate that you're working under a lot of stress," Scott said gently, trying to calm James down. "James," John said, sounding extra sincere, "I apologise. I didn't mean to have a go at you. It was just a shock when Curtis came in here and saw all of us together. We called this emergency meeting because there's a serious situation with Dave." "Why don't you sit down?" Scott said, as he reached over to a water dispenser. "How about a cold drink?" James sat down as Scott filled a paper cup from the water cooler. "They pulled Dave out of the hole for a doctor's examination earlier this morning," John explained. "The baton round fractured 3 of his ribs. One of them broke badly. A bone fragment has snapped off and punctured the surrounding tissue, causing internal bleeding." "How serious is that?" James asked. "If Dave had been x-rayed and treated immediately, it wouldn't have been bad," John said. "But by the time they dragged him out of the hole this morning, a blood clot had formed on his chest wall. He's having difficulty breathing, and he'll be hospitalised for at least 2 weeks. After that, he'll be on medication to break up the clot. He won't be back to full fitness for a couple of months at least." "So that's it?" James sighed. "You're going to pull me out of here?" "As soon as possible," John nodded. "We're as sorry as you are that this didn't work out, James. I've been in the intelligence game for 20 years, and I'm afraid complicated plans like this have a habit of going awry." James drained his paper cup and nodded when Scott offered a refill. Part of James was relieved at the prospect of getting back to campus unscathed, but a much bigger part was bitter at having gone through so much stress for nothing. "Is there no way I could carry on without Dave?" James asked. "I can't see how," John said. "You need protection." "Not anymore, I don't. You saw me come in with Curtis, and Elwood spent half the morning telling me his life story. Nobody's going to give me hassle when we're best buds." This was news to Scott and John, who exchanged a long glance. Scott said, drumming his finger thoughtfully against his cheek. "Sounds like you've put in some valuable work there. It might put a different complexion on things." "But how would James handle the escape without Dave?" John asked. "Dave was the advanced driver, and the only one big enough to wear your uniform during the escape." "I'm a good driver," James said. "Lauren can navigate, and the roads over here are nice and straight." "Your driving didn't seem so great to me the other afternoon," Scott said bluntly. "I've been able to drive for nearly a year, and that's the only accident I've ever had. Well, except right at the beginning when I nearly killed some woman's dog." "Actually," John nodded, "despite James's idiotic little adventure the other afternoon, he did score top marks on his intermediate driving course. But there's still no way he can get out of here disguised as a hack." Scott rested an elbow on the desk and waggled his finger at James. "Stand up a minute, James. How tall are you?" 162 centimetres, James said, as he climbed out of his chair. Scott looked baffled. "What's that in American money?" John smiled. "About 5 feet 2 inches. Have you got any men that small?" "Not men, I haven't. But we're an equal opportunity employer, and there is a young lady on our cell block who's about James's size." John broke into a smile. "Could you alter the staff roster so that she's on duty the night of the escape?" Scott nodded. "That shouldn't be too tough. We might have to make a few adjustments to the plan, but this is definitely doable." "So we're back in business?" John asked. "I can't see why not," Scott said. "As long as James is sure he's up to it."